It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday is coming to you on Canadian Thanksgiving, one of the few holidays I actually pay the fuck attention to when I'm recording content, because I almost skipped content this week because it's Canadian Thanksgiving, but I couldn't stop noodling over this particular concept. So, when something doesn't quite let me go like this and it's just layer, uh, I listen and do it. The reasons for this particular topic are numerous. One is that Song and I did another Two Women Talking. The topic on this one is, the defense of toxic fans. Interesting conversation. We didn't shy away from things we're legitimately critical of, but we did sort of try to understand the position on certain things, and one of the things that involved is both of us talking to people. And obviously one of the inspirations for this has been the ongoing discussion into shows. Star Wars is a big one with the kerfuffle about Rey, and then lesser, we get into this in the show, so I won't steal the thunder here, about Reva, third sister on Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then obviously She-Hulk, but also I think movies like the Captain Marvel movie, shows like Jessica Jones, the Ms. Marvel series, even though that's a teenager, they're all from sort of female points of view, but they're not like the female shows of the past, like Sex and the City or Gilmore Girls, in that they're not perceived as being primarily about relationships. They're not being seen primarily as female sphere. They're action stories, they're superhero stories. And, there's been a lot of strong reactions about it. And a lot of the reactions have been about the depictions of men in these shows. And that's what this video is about. That's the part I just couldn't shake, because I'm going to give you a bunch of theory on this and why I'm fascinated by it. Then, you guys feel free to add your own perspectives, because this is why I hesitated doing men's content. I don't know what it's like to be, assigned male at birth. I don't know what it's like to be a man. I can't speak from first person experience on this. I can just, I can do scholarship, I can do reporting, but I can't do anything experiential. So I'm going to give you the theory and the observation, and you guys can provide the experience. Sound good? Okay. If you like this sort of thing, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. Patron support is very appreciated on videos like this that the YouTube algorithm often doesn't know what to do with, but I like these videos, so I don't care. And the nice thing about Patreon support is, even if, only hundreds of people watch it instead of thousands of people watch it, it don't matter. That's why I like this system. So, traditional, and background on me for people who don't know, because there are some people who've started watching recently. I took both interdisciplinary gender studies and anthropology in university. I then went and worked on a television show called Ed and Red's Night Party. Well, it started as Ed's Night Party. It became Ed and Red's Night Party when I became co-host 7 years after I started working there. But I got to test all the feminist media criticism, but then all of the culturally relativistic approaches in anthropology in a live media setting, and saw what worked and what didn't work. And that's been the backbone of my content going forward. Because what I found is that certain things, the applications of gender that I learned in anthropology, and then elements, not all of it, but elements of Judith Butler's gender performativity theory held up very well. Gaze theory didn't work worth a shit. And what I ended up determining is that especially male gaze theory has become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people think media is saying something about all women instead of the particular women depicted on the show. And that's torquing their interpretations of it. What I find interesting about shows like She-Hulk is that now people are doing that with the men on the show. And because I'm coming at it excuse me, I didn't believe this worked when it was male gaze. I don't necessarily believe this works with female gaze. And I think it's interesting that Jessica Jones didn't get the same reaction, because obviously, the big antagonist in the first season was Purple Man. And I guess maybe because it was David Tennant, people didn't see him as just all guys. But, I mean, the depictions of straight men, other than Luke Cage, in Jessica Jones, not the most complimentary. Now, of course, women don't look great on that show either, but still. I know there was a kerfuffle around Captain Marvel, but that seemed to be less specifically, that was angry, as opposed to the feedback to She-Hulk, which is guys feeling, they feel attacked. And that seems to come from the presumption that the show is saying something about men instead of saying something about the life and perspective of Jen Walters, aka She-Hulk. And because I don't subscribe to male gaze theory, at least not a single male gaze, I don't subscribe to female gaze theory either. I think there is a Hollywood homogenizing of the human experience, where they just take whatever look, whatever aesthetic is the most expensive at any given time, shove that on TV, whether people find it attractive or not, because it's an advertiser-driven medium and they're selling products. And I think it's interesting that since we've gone to streaming, the diversity of things like body type has opened up, because all of a sudden, streaming platforms, yes, the shows might be subsidized by brands. Is it Cobra Kai that keeps using like Coors Banquet and like Almond Joy or something like that? But those services are driven by subscriptions. It's a whole new monetization model. And the big problem with Hollywood, it has always been an issue, is that LA is a real bubble. And people in LA, even if they're from other places, they forget what the rest of the world is like. Because even 4 days in LA, you start to forget what the rest of the world is like. The whole place is this weird unreality. And so a lot of people feel like what they see in media doesn't reflect their life. Now, the thing that's interesting to me about She-Hulk is I felt really like finally a show was pointing out some of the horrible experiences of woman world. It's not high school or middle school trauma like you usually see. It's the shittiness of feminized adulthood with, the psychotic wedding and, the horrible stylist and the various other things. I mean, online dating is not something I have personal experience with, but I hear people complaining about it all the time. And so to me, I see She-Hulk the way I see every other Marvel superhero first origin series, right? Which is the original Thor was Norse gods talking Shakespeare. The original Captain America was a Steve McQueen homage. You know, the original Iron Man was Robert Downey Jr. as a shorthand for Iron Man's alcoholism, so you don't have to do the Iron Man alcoholism storyline, because that was rough in the comics, right? You got, you know, and so on and so forth. Moon Knight vision, right? We don't say that any of those are stories about men or about women or, you know, any particular thing about them attacking, well, unless you're pop culture addict doing the Falcon and Winter Soldier, but nobody's saying that they felt attacked by depictions of women in these, you know, stories about men, even though, let's face it, a pretty major trope of superhero fiction is that the girl the main character is interested in, whether that be Mary Jane or Lois Lane, why do they all rhyme, you know, is originally into the superhero but doesn't like, you know, Spider-Man's cool, Peter Parker's Lois Lane's all about Superman but sort of ignores Clark. That thing is a trope in superhero stories, right? Even, you know, even Jane Foster in the Thor movie thinks Thor's a jerk at first. Thor was a jerk at first. But we don't see the depiction of these women as saying something about all women. We sort of accept the, well, this is the trope. But because we don't have the complementary tropes when we do something like She-Hulk, and She-Hulk is the one that really breaks the mold, because with Ms. Marvel, it's that sort of teenager / Bollywood thing that I guess people could understand better because it's been so done to death. But you get into She-Hulk and all of a sudden they're trying to take tropes from legal dramas where everyone's half a scumbag. And it becomes, this is about all men. And I found that fascinating. My identity's under attack. Because for years there's been this debate of whether the depictions of various female characters in cinema done by male directors can be seen to be saying something about all of womanhood, right? Because you tend to get those tropes of, oh, it's the good girl Friday who supports the male lead, or you've got the bad girl femme fatale who antagonizes the male lead, and supporting male good, antagonizing male bad, you know, and there's been much ink spilled in feminist circles about that. So I'm trying to figure out if that stuff has primed men to see the same thing in She-Hulk, when my take on She-Hulk is that these are the men that Jen, who is a complete hot mess, notices. And to me, because she's talking to camera, because it's all first person, because it borrows heavily from Fleabag. And I mean, maybe that's the issue with the show. It's trying to be Fleabag meets Rick and Morty meets legal show. And it's trying to do too many things in a half-hour format. Who knows? But, you know, to me, because it's first-person perspective, that tells me cinematically, it's like, right, first-person view in a game. You're in the driver's seat. That's supposed to just be you in a suit, right? And you don't expect a terribly well-developed protagonist in a first-person game. Third person game, yeah, because you're looking at the person all the time. You're like their buddy, or the director, the action sequences. You're not the guy in the suit. And so with Jen talking to camera and everything being her point of view, I just saw the whole show as a commentary on, well, she only meets sleazeballs because that's who she expects to meet. Now, of course, I'm coming from the superhero perspective of, for years, having to access superhero stuff through the supporting characters, because the main character was never intended to be a proxy for me or my experience. So it's like, all the women are phenomenally, impossibly attractive in comic books because that's the perception of the male lead. Mary Jane's the most beautiful woman in the world because that's how Peter perceives her. Realistically, probably not. I mean, they want to make her a model and all that stuff, but, that's how I squared it, because it's a medium of art, often with impossible proportions. No human being is reasonably expected to look like that. And that was my perception on it. I thought that was the common view. And She-Hulk has totally shattered my perceptions on that. The Captain Marvel movie, I understood to an extent. The Black Widow movie, not enough people saw to really have a discussion about it. And it's really hard to analyze Black Widow or Captain Marvel in the same way because those movies were profoundly mediocre. The thing that makes She-Hulk so interesting is it actually says something. It actually takes a point of view. And that's what seems to have caused all the issues. And I find that fascinating because it's either, well, male gaze theory is correct and women have had the right to complain all along, or you can't summarize any commentary about all men or commentary about all women from a single work of media. It's all about the individual director, character, thematic view, so on and so forth, right? Both can't be true. And I still, and this is why I find it so fascinating, that identifying with Jen, identifying with She-Hulk, I don't think for a second the show's being shitty to men. Because I understand the experiences is drawing from, because then you got Wong, and you got, Daredevil, like Matt Murdock finally made an appearance, and like the characters whose names we recognize, like even Abomination is sort of an ambivalent character. All sort of the superhero characters are kind of all right. It's the rando guys that I think they're pulling from, shows like The Good Wife, which really needs to be parodied. Holy shit, that show and The Good Fight just kept getting worse. And like, maybe because the male audience didn't watch that show, they're not seeing that element of the spoof, because everyone on shows like that, on shows like LA Law, on shows like Suits, was half to 3/4 a scumbag. And this is where we get into the issue of ever claiming that a piece of media intends to say something about men or intends to say something about women. Because the minute you start defining a main character, right, you have to settle on a gender, you have to settle on a race, you have to settle on a socioeconomic bracket, you have to settle on a religion or lack thereof. There's all these things that you can't tell everyone's story at once. And so how can we ever say a show is about women or a show is about men. And I think that was the mistake that both the Black Widow and Captain Marvel movies made, which was what made them so profoundly mediocre, is that they were afraid to give Carol Danvers a defined personality. Because, oh, first female Marvel lead superhero, right? She has to be everything for all women, and so they made her fucking boring. You know? And the MCU never figured out what to do with Natasha Romanoff. There was that bright shining moment in, was it Civil War? I think, where they had that scene where she was really interesting. They were like really interested in Captain America's love life. And it's like, all right, she seems like a Russian lady here, right? She seems like there's some semblance of character to grasp onto here. And then it was gone. They decided to go with the Whedon interpretation again going forward. And the Black Widow movie was this weird Disney format, mommy, daddy, two sisters, nuclear family where Red Guardian just overpowered all the other women in every scene he was in, and that was really fucking weird. And then the enemy is like hidden Russian scientist / Nazi patriarchy dude who, you know, is evil because he sterilized a bunch of girls and turned them into super spies. And then she defeats him through a ridiculous act of self-harm. And I was sitting here watching the movie going, this is Mad Libs, right? And then you got Florence Pugh, who just shows up there, plays a fucking character, and blows everybody off the screen. But I think that even though people were rightly disappointed in those movies, if they even saw Black Widow, it didn't create the same red flags in their heads. And those red flags are really real. And again, I'm trying to figure out, and this is where you guys can help me out because I can't understand the perspective. What I know is that the way I go into media is this is a story about a particular person. A game dev named Vander Caballero said once about video games that game developers approach storytelling through the realm of art. Reviewers in the media approach games storytelling through the realm of criticism. And everybody needs to stay in their damn lane. You can't make a video game that people are going to love if you're coming in as a critic. You have to make art. And that means you have to tell stories that are relatively personal and recognize that not everybody's going to get it. And so we get stuff like, you know, the works of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and a lot of the, you know, all the Scorsese output that tells stories about a particular type of man. Not all men. A particular type of man. And then you get other people who come along and add to the dialogue, like the Black Panther movie, right? You know, hey, let's make a movie where Black people are centered and not as an oppressed group, as a technologically advanced society with sort of an Afrocentric flair. Cool, right? You know, we get that when a man's centered, that this isn't about all men. This is about a subsection of masculinity. And that was always the issue with not enough focus on Black, Hispanic, gay, women, so on and so forth, that it just kept telling stories where white men were centered. And from the realm of art, that's not a good or a bad thing. That's just, there are all these other stories to tell that aren't getting told because you keep going back to this well. But while that's true in theory, when it happened in practice, again, people felt attacked. But what we also know is that thing I said, that, when you make art, not everybody's going to get it. I love Hideo Kojima's stuff because he makes shit knowing people ain't going to get it. And no matter how many times his female characters, because he plays with archetypes and then undermines the archetype, he subverts the archetype. Naming characters quiet and fragile, and then they're really anything but. They are the opposite, quiet. Her actions are very loud and fragile is anything but fragile, right? But all people see is the beginning. They don't follow the story through to the end. And there's got to be something about either human brains, something about the lizard brain, or the priming that the commentary surrounding media has done, that means that men saw themselves in those utter douchebags on She-Hulk. Because, I saw, because I watched the show Suits. I liked Lewis. And I watched The Good Wife because I'm like, hey, I like Christine Baranski, right? But I got so fucking sick of all the goddamn smarm and all the narcissism and all the ego. And these are not regular guys. These are assholes. These are like stock character lawyer show shit. And is it just that there's not enough crossover between those shows and comic book fandom in terms of viewership for people to see that's what they were doing, despite the constant references to lawyer show? Because one of the big codes for me, and this may not be something men get, watching Suits, especially, Jessica and Donna's clothes were fire. Rachel's less show, so they never really figured out how to dress Meghan Markle, except putting her in a pencil skirt on a stool. That was her role on the show. That ass. But, what's her name? Gina Torres, and I forget the actress's name that played Donna. Their wardrobe was fire, amazing, but totally inappropriate for a standard workplace like that. You couldn't walk in a court in a lot of those outfits. First of all, those are not all-day shoes. Second of all, you can barely sit in those dresses. You certainly can't eat in them, right? It was a throwback to like those 80s primetime dramas like Dallas and Dynasty, where everything was ridiculous and it was high fashion, and that is not the real world. And I see that in She-Hulk with the friend who has increasingly loud makeup that you could never wear to court in most places. You can't show up with pink and yellow eyeshadow in most law firms. It's not considered workplace appropriate. And to me, those were little codes that this is not life, this is lawyer show. And it's almost like they didn't get that people weren't going to pick up on the code and weren't going to pick up on the Rick and Morty code. And I don't expect guys to have watched Fleabag. And so all the code that tells certain people what this show is got lost on a large section of the audience. And that's when we get into the whole thing about this is a show for people who watch legal shows like The Good Fight in Suits, superhero fans, and Rick and Morty fans, and Fleabag. Like, okay, that's an intersection of four very specific things, and maybe it was too on the nose, right? But that is clearly the target. That is clearly the inspiration. The same way, you know, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is Jackie Chan homage meets Avatar. Black Widow borrowed heavily from The Americans, and so on and so forth. It's all format, playing with format. You know, Falcon and Winter Soldier borrowed heavily from the Bourne movies, and that sort of caper stuff. But with all that code missed, people took it as a commentary about men. And I really want to know why. Because all the theory that I found worked in media. And just because people have issues with She-Hulk doesn't mean it didn't work. Art should challenge. Comedy should challenge, right? Like, you guys know I support the right to offend. But why is there still an assumption that anything attempts to say something about all men or all women? Is it the issue with the Disney formula that everybody's so used to? Is it being force-fed the whole male gaze theory thing? What is it? Because as somebody who's made stuff, that has never been, that's for the studio and marketing and, oh, we want this demographic and this demographic and this demographic. People who make this stuff, it's like, this is a show about these particular characters and we're going to make the world reflect them. You know, every show is essentially WandaVision in that it's a world constructed to draw out the character of the main character. That's how they write these things. I think it's trying to bring in that element of, you know, that comic book art style, that art is a huge part of the experience when you read a comic book. But why choose to say this is a show that's attacking men instead of recognizing that no movie, TV show, book, comic, anything has ever been about all men or all women? What am I missing here? Because again, if you accept that this is a show that's attacking men, then that means gaze theory is right. Male gaze theory is right. And in my experience, male gaze theory's not right. It works terribly. It falls apart when you try to apply it. So again, what am I missing here? Let me know. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. You have been watching Manly Mondays.